It's a tough act to follow and a difficult introduction to try and live up to. I'm just a sort of struggling aspirant. When I wrote my first book about 25, 30 years ago, it was a great honor and a great privilege that His Holiness the Dalai Lama agreed to release the book, and it was only a gesture of encouragement to a student who wasn't sort of doing very well with himself. And so I, of course, was over the moon that His Holiness was releasing my book. And so the book was released, and he came on stage and began to speak, and I was on top of Mount Everest. And then he said, my Rajiv is a student of mine. He works very hard, but how much he knows, I don't know. And I'm afraid that truth has remained for 25, 30 years. And if I needed any sort of reassurance that that was still the case, less than a month ago in Goa, we were launching the Dalai Lama chair of Nalanda Studies. And so at the end of his talk, His Holiness, referring to me again, said, Rajiv has been an old student of mine, but these days he's a little sleepy. So between how much I know and my sort of sleepiness, I'm afraid there isn't a great deal of wisdom to share. So I do that with great sort of trepidation and humility, and as I said to fellow travelers of the path, I have been deeply blessed, and it can only be past life karma to have had some remarkable teachers who have been most indulgent to me. And so the tradition that I inherit started really with the Ramakrishna mission, and I received Diksha from Swami Ranganathanandaji, who later became president, and I've been a student of B.K. Iyengar, the great yoga icon in Pune, but His Holiness the Dalai Lama is my root guru. And so I'm deeply honored as an unworthy student to be able to talk about what is it that I, in my many imperfections, learned from His Holiness. And I think that the most powerful message as an aspirant has been that he really is, as he describes himself, a simple Buddhist monk who happens to be the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet. Though that is the title that he holds, he is the quintessential monk who embodies in human form the highest human aspiration to human perfection. He is going to be 85, and I learn from him by as much as who he is as by what he does and the manner in which he is celebrated and respected. So here is a man who is considered by his followers, including people like me, to be a manifestation of the Buddha aspect of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, and we call them bodhisattvas. And so here is a bodhisattva who at 84 still does 4 to 5 hours of spiritual practice every day. So it isn't as if that in terms of popular perception that enlightenment or wisdom or flashing lights or whatever we associate respectively with spiritual illumination is a one-time event, and from there another sort of misnomer that bliss follows. It is a constant engagement with life and living. So not only does he do sort of 4 or 5 hours of sadhana and practice every day, but he also receives, again, until recently because he is aging, instruction and transmissions from many lamas, often younger than himself, so that there is a continuity of transmission that happens. So in some ways that we are all, the Dalai Lama is then we need all of us so much more to be eternal sadhaks and eternal students. There is no single transforming experience that endures for eternity or lifetimes to come. Underlying that principle is a very powerful motivation. And when I spoke about Bodhisattva, and with the Bodhisattva is, so all of us in that tradition take what we call a Bodhicitta vow. And the principle of Bodhicitta is a shift from the traditional understanding in many traditions, including Hinduism, as to the aspiration of the spiritual quest. So in this case, it is not the kingdom of heaven, it is not nirvana or moksha, as we tend to understand it, but it is really to reach a level of wisdom and the understanding and the insight of the nature of reality, to be able to choose consciously to take rebirth in human form and the suffering of the human condition to teach and serve humanity. So, according to traditional belief, there can be no higher motivation than to embrace the human condition in order to help other people. And that surely is the most profound manifestation and expression of compassion. The power of compassion, the motivation of compassion, is not merely looked at as being something that is virtuous, in the sense it's good, and if you do it, the gods will be pleased, or we will earn brownie points. From an understanding of karma, which is central to the entire the philosophies of the Indic heritage, is the recognition that we craft our own destiny and our unfolding present and unfolding futures. And how do we do that? And again, there is a distinction here that, say, this is the centenary year of Gandhiji, and, Gandhiji famously said that the means are as important as the ends. And, but in our tradition, it really is, it is the motivation, the intention. The closest Hindi word is hamari niyat kya hai. तो हम किस नियत से जो हम करते हैं and what that does really is, and this is where our understanding of karma emerges, that every thought creates an imprint on our consciousness, and at the subtlest and deepest layers of consciousness. And it is the accumulation of these different karmic imprints that determines our reflexive impulses. So how we think. So how do we impact how we think is by working on our mental diets. So just as we have physical diets, we eat different kinds of food, we also consume different kinds of thoughts and ideas. Many of them are consumed passively, because we are bombarded by television images, we are engulfed in a larger discourse which impacts us in ways that we're not conscious about. Similarly, that we eat physical foods without reflecting on what we're eating or why we're eating. And just like the wrong kinds of food can create indigestion, can create ill health, so similarly, an inappropriate mental diet can create mental instability, problems, crises, pain, depression, and all that we confront. So the aspiration of the tradition of our actual, not just Buddhism, but India's spiritual heritage has been that we offer to the world the most sophisticated mind training techniques at any point in history. And what is the goal of those mind training insights? It is to enable us to change our mental diets so that our deepest reflexive responses are impacted. So it makes no sense if there is something that I may say or that I may share, or a great teacher or a great orator says and shares, and we say, "Wow, how wonderful! This is really real." Or we repeat these quotes, we put up quotations in our rooms and under our table, unless it impacts our reflexive responses. And by reflexive responses, I mean when there is a stimulus, something happens, you don't sit there and sort of calculate or calibrate your responses, you just respond. So that is for us and for the Dalai Lama, the aspiration of the human enterprise to be able to change our mental diets, to change who we are to an infinite degree of compassion, so that we consciously choose to continue to embrace the human condition, to teach and serve humanity. This is the guiding principle of the Dalai Lama, and what I most importantly learn from him. And when I say learn, it is thus far I have not reached the stage of wisdom where I can honestly say that I have so internalized it, and it is a reflexive response. I'm a struggling student, and as we're told with the Buddha, and certainly His Holiness has told me, at one point I said to the Dalai Lama, I said, I've been a student of yours for 30 years, or whatever, 40 years, and nothing is happening. I still get upset, and sometimes I feel envy, and I feel jealousy, and I feel all these sort of awful, human emotions that I know I shouldn't. And his response was, what's the hurry? It takes lifetimes. It takes a lot of effort. And we need to consider that, there is a Rubicon in Western psychology and Western training and mind training of 10,000 hours. I don't know where it came from, but it's sort of, I think it's a representative figure. And they say that if you want to become a great musician or a maestro or a great cricketer or whatever it is, that you need to spend 10,000 hours training yourselves. And we just need to reflect that here's a man who at 84, the Dalai Lama, the preeminent Buddhist monk and one of the most respected spiritual leaders in the world, is spending 5-6 hours a day continuing to train his mind. But we cannot find the time to spend, 5 minutes a day or 5 hours a week in order to train our minds. So we can spend that beautifying ourselves. We can spend that losing weight, which is something I need to do. We can spend it trying to grow hair, which I fail to do. So we can spend it on a zillion different distractions, even our professions, or training ourselves so that we can get good jobs and skills and what have you. But the processor of all that is the mind. And we cannot find the time or engage with the context to train our minds. Now, having said that, the other remarkable aspect of the Dalai Lama is that we do not claim exclusivity. The Dalai Lama doesn't claim that my method of training the mind is the best, or it's the only one. So just like each one of us need a different physical diet because of our mental dispositions, because of our health. If I'm diabetic, I need something else. If I'm in a particular climate, I need a different kind of food. So each one of us needs a different mental diet. And so we have no problem. The Dalai Lama has no problem going to a mosque and doing the namaz, or going to a church and singing a hymn and putting a cross around his neck. It comes from a deep respect that we need different mental diets, and that this diet is suitable for me and another diet is suitable for you. And can you imagine how important in today's time that recognition is, and not as a passive recognition where we talk about tolerance or we accept that you need it. Actually, what we're really saying, and the Dalai Lama is saying, is I celebrate it. I celebrate the mental diet that you need. It's like I need a particular mental diet. It is as simple as that when you think about it. Each religious and philosophical tradition has its origins in particular social realities and contexts. And those contexts change and they evolve and they're dynamic. And certainly in India, we have had many great masters and reformers, different religions and different traditions, who come along and in the context of changing realities and also changing impacts at different levels of evolutionary biology. So the human being at 500 years ago, or at the time of the Buddha, 2,500 years ago, or as for the Christian tradition, 2,000, whatever, so different spans of time, just because of evolutionary biology, we have changed. And it took the early years of evolution, from amoeba to mammals to, two-legged beings, to monkeys, to agriculture, to fire, to stone. But each level took thousands of billions of years to move from one to the other, till the human mind began to assert itself, which accelerated the process of evolution, where the products of the mind, and one marker was certainly the Industrial Revolution. So before, you had implements that you used, and then you had a machine that you set in motion and you could set back. And this wasn't even animal power, it was just a machine. And from then on, the material and mental universe of the human species has grown so rapidly that evolution hasn't been able to keep up with it. And that balance continues to enlarge. And the only way that we can begin to look at the mental diet that we now need is to explore and understand the changing nature of reality and our changing understanding of reality. And that led His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, to a very active engagement with contemporary knowledge, the contemporary range of knowledge, including, in the early days, religious communities were isolated. To see what we could learn from a conversation and dialogue with other traditions, and to incorporate them in our practice. And interestingly, the tradition of India, and I look at Hinduism in its largest framework, and I think the closest approximation comes from Radhakrishnan's Hindu view of life, and other people who've spoken in that vein, way of life, and it is no single set of practices, was that in our civilization was its ability to assimilate, process, draw upon diverse sources of wisdom. Interestingly, as Buddhism evolved, Buddhism was more effectively assimilated. So you have now, Buddhism, Southeast Asia, Northern Transmission, Southern Transmission, and And what was the element in that philosophy? It doesn't make any one of them superior or inferior to the other. So the element in it was that the Buddha, like the Dalai Lama, presented himself as a human being, who remained a human being, who went through the suffering of the human condition during his lifetime. So it wasn't based on something larger or more profound, but his understanding, or inverted commas, realizations, were processed by human mind in human form, finally, and then shared after much hesitation. And what was that hesitation? That hesitation was that when we talk about spirituality and spiritual experience, we are talking about an experience that transcends concepts, is non-conceptual. Now, if I can't even explain to you what horrid thing which I indulge in sometimes, Coca-Cola tastes like, unless you have tasted it, it's going to be impossible for me to share with you inverted commas, spiritual experience, or the mind state that the spiritual quest can nurture in an individual. And so our tradition evolved both method and wisdom. And this is the tradition, the Dalai Lama describes himself as the inheritor of the Nalanda tradition. And I just want to take a few more minutes to tell you about what we understand as the Nalanda tradition, because and that is India's heritage that traveled from India to Tibet. And we are in the process, we're having a conversation with a friend here, about looking at the study of the Nalanda tradition, because it combines method and wisdom. And what do we mean by method and wisdom? We have grown up in a system of knowledge in contemporary India, no matter what references we make to our glorious past, and we make too many references to our glorious past and seem to learn nothing from it. So it just become one of those hallowed things. We say, oh, we were great and wonderful, and it doesn't matter what we are today. So that tradition taught us method and wisdom. And it was that the wisdom aspect is, in our contemporary education, comes from the Western Socratic tradition, where things are verbalized, communicated through a verbal process, evaluated through a verbal process, governed by vocabulary. But the human experience goes far beyond any vocabulary. And so our systems introduced methods simultaneous to the wisdom. Now, you cannot get the wisdom of the Buddha, the wisdom, I can't certainly, of the Dalai Lama, but I can get an intuition, a sense, a glimpse, even if transitory and passing, of this process. And so my understanding and realization of it is deeper. A very classic example from sort of recent literature, because of my interest in the Ramakrishna movement, was that it was like Swami Vivekananda. He was getting all these teachings all the time from Thakur, as you know, I grew up in Calcutta, so we call him Thakur. And so there is this great yearning, and he just keeps saying to Ramakrishna that, touch me. I want an experience of all that you're telling me verbally. Even Ramakrishna himself, he goes and picks up his sword, and I'm going to kill myself because I'm not getting an experience. I'm getting the knowledge, and the knowledge is useless unless it has been processed and assimilated by human experience. Now, nothing I'm saying is absolute. This is our approach. This is our civilization heritage. There's no question that there will be other traditions and other approaches that make perfectly good human beings. And they could be atheists, they could be agnostics, they could be anybody. So I'm really here to share from the Buddhist lens what is our collective Indian civilization heritage and the insights it offers. And today, people who meet the Dalai Lama, and I must say, they're impacted not just by what he says, because through these processes of realization, he has become a particular kind of human being. So it is that process of the method and the wisdom that must coexist. And that, when I say that, the 10,000 hours of practice or whatever that I'm urging or recommending and saying that we do not have time for, is really what His Holiness is demonstrating in his life. And when I was making these allusions to social realities, it is also the willingness to embrace contemporary wisdom that has evolved in recent centuries. So we have to look at, today in the United States, there are 40% of teachers who do not believe in evolution, because it runs contrary to their system of faith. So faith and so-called rationality are in conflict. And that is often the source of larger societal conflict. I'm hoping that in our session this evening, when we look at the idea and discuss the ideas of communal harmony, we will be able to reflect and touch on some of these aspects. That what if there are fundamental differences? Because we have to recognize, appreciate, celebrate diversity. It's no good just being syncretic and saying, we're all the same people, we're all human beings, and let's be happy and it's all hunky-dory, because it doesn't work. So I just wanted to flag that what I share doesn't come from a sense of certitude that this is the way it is and there's no other way. It's a way that works for us and a certain community of people. So today he has introduced the study of science in every monastery. There is an ongoing proactive engagement with some of the best scientists in the world. Ways in which, so it's not like we seek validation to be able to say, we had plastic surgery and we were doing space travel thousands of years ago. To really see that in our spiritual quest that involves the understanding of the nature of reality, what is science today telling us about the nature of reality. Can we learn from them? Can they learn from us? Because even science needs hypotheses, which they then begin to explore. So maybe we can give them some hypotheses that they might find value and interesting. Maybe they can help us understand through their methodologies and techniques some of the things that we find difficult to grasp. And one, example is, a very sort of strong example is emerging, and that is a lot of it is emerging from quantum physics. So when we have a lot of discussion here about vibrations and the impact they make, now at one level it sounds sort of a little hunky-dory. But if you go into Western science and say, okay, what is synchronicity? What is mimicry? What is it that prompts or makes two particles, zillion miles apart, without anything between each other, completely mimic each other? It defines all logic in a traditional sense. So science is getting us to push the boundaries of the capacities of the human mind. And that is where your Einstein and Stephen Hawkins and things come in. Because if they just stuck with traditional wisdom, as we tend to in our sort of spiritual religious aspirations, or the completely inexplicable, and then try to give it definitiveness, we run into trouble. So the genius of a spiritual master who comes along is to be able to be open. So quantum physics is now today telling us that, look, even the very nature of reality that you're talking about is determined by the presence of the observer. So how can I stand up here and say to you that, look, my understanding of reality is final? Because this has been experimentally proven. But we also recognize that just because something is experimentally not proven doesn't mean it's not true or true. So it is that I'm trying to give you a sense of that openness of mind, of embracing all knowledge and processing it through technique, wisdom, and method. And just so that I cannot sort of emphasize enough the importance of the notion of method and wisdom. Because one area that's going wrong, where, mostly there's wisdom with no method, but where there's method but with no wisdom is in the teaching and practice of yoga. Because yoga is merely a method. And if you do not apply the method towards the wisdom that it is aspiring to, so if you say that, look, I'm in the practice of yoga and, it's been recommended to me because the size of my waist is that, look, you should just, keep pumping your stomach. But if I have a hernia, I'm dead. So it has to be personalized. It has to be seen in the context of my own particular need. So that is the other. It is the particularization, the individualization of that quest to your particular physiological and psychological needs. And that is what great masters and great teachers do. And we're not arguing at all to say that, the Dalai Lama is the greatest master ever, or, sort of that kind of hierarchy. I'm just sharing with you what it is, the value it has added to me as a student. And it has been the ability to reach out on contemporary issues with great vigor. So it is engagement with science and rationality. It is going out into working on interfaith dialogue and conversation. And as I mentioned to you about going in the willingness to go out and embrace the practices and traditions of other traditions, is a very powerful message that it embodies. And I would strongly recommend the exhibition that is being hosted with just some images of this exercise and engagement. A very important area of intervention has been on gender, on women. And this is something that many faiths are struggling with. And so when His Holiness came out from Tibet in 1959, Tibet was a feudal country, and it was 6 million people in a very large area, and there were sort of the monasteries were self-sufficient communities. There wasn't that much conflict because each family was was giving their eldest son as to be a monk, and so it went on, and so there was this commitment, and the feminist movement was growing in the 60s, beginning to gain momentum, and so it was presented to His Holiness. Look, you are a preeminent Buddhist monk. Why don't you go out and start enabling and get women to be on par with men. The Dalai Lama is not the Pope, the God. He cannot just decree and say, look, henceforth, this is going to happen. And when that happens, there is social, turmoil, which is what, we're engaging with. Court cannot just turn around and decree that this is it. So it is a question of leadership creating and nurturing a perspective that brings about change. So he began a process of building consensus. And about 4 years ago, with great satisfaction, that we now have what we call Geshe Mas. Now, a Geshe degree in the Tibetan tradition is like a PhD. So the Tibetan monks who are part of the social structures go through 8 to 9 years before they can, they are qualified to teach. And they're awarded the Geshe is like the PhD, and that's the highest degree. And so now we have nuns who get the Geshe, and they call Geshe Mas. But there is still an unfolding challenge, which means that we have been institutionally able to give them this, but social acceptance is taking time to evolve and to follow. So there's a great lesson here on how do we nurture and bring out change that is continuous and engaged, which doesn't create a level of disruption so that the resistance is so strong that the baby goes out with the bathwater. So these are traditions and practices that have, gone on for. I'll just 2 minutes is what I have left. I just want to go back and conclude with the idea of compassion, and why compassion, not just because of His Holiness, that is a tradition. And today we know is that the Dalai Lama has nurtured a radical reorientation of our obsession with self. And why is that important? Not just because the divine will be pleased or our karma will be erased. It is today modern scientific research to the degree that, we have to recognize that today's scientific truths can turn out to be falsehoods later and vice versa. But today's psychological testings tell us that people who are unhappy, forget mental problems, when they go to psychiatrists and are interviewed, you will find a very large number of I, me, mine as a part of the conversation. So it is this obsession plainly with the self, which is what our economic system, our social system, our political system is nurturing. That is the source of human dissatisfaction. And that when we can train people using method and wisdom to be able to think about other people, that sense of the self, the I that suffers, softens. And as it softens, we begin to experience greater fullness of life, greater equanimity. So the guiding aspiration of method and wisdom is how we can nurture a realization of compassion. How do we do that? I'll just give you a little snapshot of the method and the wisdom. So, what is the wisdom that circumscribes this? The wisdom that circumscribes it is very commonplace. Now, in our traditions, we believe a lot in reincarnation. It is not essential, but I'm giving you one piece of wisdom if you do. If I believe in reincarnation, everybody in this room has at some point been my father, mother, brother, or sister. And if I begin to think in those lines, and I keep repeating this to myself, if that gentleman there has been my father in some lifetime, it doesn't mean that I will not stop feeling affection for him in this lifetime. Or that we live in an interdependent world. So the fact that I'm here, started with, where's this wonderful lady? Manjari. She organizes an event. She has people working for her. Boeing made an aircraft, even though they're otherwise, people are dying in their flights. I take an aircraft to come. I eat food which a farmer has made. So my very survival, my being here, someone has put this microphone, someone has manufactured this. I live in an interdependent world. I cannot function without it. So if I begin to think of that my very existence is dependent on other people, then naturally I'll say, I'll think even more highly of her than I do now, because she has enabled something larger than myself to happen. And so did the guy who cooked me breakfast this morning. I'd be really hungry and, unable to speak if I didn't have a good breakfast. So right from, the little tiny bit, the tiny fragments to the larger picture, we realize how interdependent our lives are. So in our practice, we will have a whole range of these kinds, we call it analytical meditation, where we present to ourselves in meditation a structured plan. It's called the Lamrim, it's called the graduated path, that will make us realize, if we spend those 10,000 hours, about the nature of compassion and the nature of, and the other thing is that, is the other sort of, the pillar is, impermanence, that everything is changing. And the final, which is, much more, three pillars on which the tradition stands, is the idea of, shunya. And I don't have the verbal, the vocabulary to describe it, but, the common English phrases are emptiness of inherent existence, emptiness, and what have you. I don't want to go down that route because it is an extremely complex idea that has to be experienced. I have not experienced it. I have the verbal vocabulary. I don't want to inflict that on you. But just so that you at least academically know that there is the idea that the self does not independently exist as a part of this softening the sense of self. And so ultimately, it is not just about large, high philosophy, but it is about the good heart. And His Holiness has written a wonderful commentary on the Bible, because he says one of the things he learned from the Bible was the practice of seva, of service, which our traditions in India have substantially lost. So that's why I think we need to thank our supporters here, because it's very easy to get corporate social responsibility, for money to put into temples so that your karma can be raised, or you can express other sort of metaphysical realities, but not something like this. And ultimately, it happens, and whenever the rare occasion that anyone wants to suffer listening to me, I always conclude by reminding them that what His Holiness always reminds me. I mean, if he was in this, if he was sitting there and I was walking past him and I was within earshot, he would whisper in my ear, "Practice, practice, practice," because you can talk till doomsday, but unless we practice, 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 we can listen to speakers, we can attend festivals, but if we don't practice, it doesn't mean my practice or the Buddha's practice. It means whatever practice is appropriate for your mental diet. Without practice, nothing happens. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to try and answer any questions that you might have. I do not promise coherent, cogent responses, but I will give it a shot. So,
There were Shramans and there were Brahmins. When you read Granthsang, you see it's all the same. In the Indian tradition, you said there are many paths. When did Buddhism really become Buddhism?
There's no, Buddhism is a phrase which you use in the English language, and the Buddha does not own Buddhism. It's not 23rd of March or year 1733. These are, when you start looking at an evolutionary process, it was 100 years before the first group of people sat down and even decided to collect the Buddha's teachings. The Buddha in his own lifetime said, "Please do not be limited by what I said. I have often contradicted myself because I have spoken to people with different mental dispositions. So don't even take my word for it." Then you have a whole range of teachers, who came, Nagarjuna, Atisha, they continue. And it is the Dalai Lama today, who's also one of those teachers, who have continued to take it further. So just like we struggle in saying, what is Hinduism? So in the same way that we just say that it is a tradition that drew its inspiration from Siddhartha, who we then decided to call the Buddha. He didn't call himself the Buddha. So unlike other theistic traditions, which started at a particular point when the revelation came and the revelation was proclaimed. So even within the Buddha's own lifetime, the process of change continued to evolve. So there's no particular time, and it traveled to different parts of the world within the historical context. Yeah.
I understand that, but is it basically Buddhism basically a Western definition of the way of life or the practice of the Buddha? I'm talking about the term Buddhism. That's it.
I mean, honestly, I don't know as to who first used the phrase Buddhism.
Would the Dalai Lama call himself a Buddhist?
Sorry?
Does he call himself a Buddhist?
Please take mic.
Does the Dalai Lama call himself a Buddhist?
Well, he calls himself a student of the Buddha, as you know, and I am a student of the Dalai Lama. And from lived experience, so there's an interesting story from the Buddha's life. Ananda was one of his attendant, student. And so, like, I went to my teacher and said, 40 years, nothing is happening. Of course, he said that the minute you think something is happening, nothing is. It's a very important pointer, because it's not only the teacher who just says it because he should, so that you don't get ego, but it's also true. Because in this tradition, there is no sudden cataclysmic moment. So myth and legend, even around the Buddha, said, look, there were all these thousands of lifetimes of coming together and the journey and the quest. I mean, he did his sadhana, and, he didn't eat for years, and that story is all very popular, and it's out there. And so it is this, it's completely evolutionary. And so what Buddhism, I think that much more than in Buddhism, because there are some aspects of, nature, reality and suffering and Four Noble Truths and things. But in Hinduism, it's even more complex. And I think we are struggling because we're looking at, I'm Hindu, I'm X or Y. And which is why I hesitate to, I have some notion of, I know what you're saying, and I have some notion of when and why it might have happened. And really it happened once the British came to India, and there were the archaeological excavation, and they began to find all these, these findings. And then that sort of, it galloped. And as it began to, so actually the Tibetans used to call it Arya Bhumi, land of the Aryans. It wasn't the land of the Buddha per se. And there's a very important, thank you for just triggering this off. I thought I'd mention it. You might find it interesting when we talk about vocabulary and conceptual experience. It's really important to understand. Because when Buddhism traveled to Tibet, and I have a better idea about what happened when it traveled to Tibet than when it went to Sri Lanka and other places, the scriptures traveled. But more importantly, it was the method that traveled. So you had Nagarjuna, you had many of these teachers who traveled with the wisdom and with the method. They taught the method to dovetail with it. So in most traditions, it is the word, it is the scripture that travels, and then we keep interpreting it. So when it traveled to Tibet, they found that the Sanskrit language in which it had been documented didn't have the nuance and the vocabulary to capture it. So they expanded the vocabulary. They came up with new words in order to capture the non-conceptual experience that the practice of Buddhism was creating. We know from English language, when we try and talk about nirvana or moksha, it's not really what it is. Even if you just want to talk about happiness, look at the number of words we have in, is sukha and dukkha is what the Buddha taught. It's not unhappiness or suffering. It's much more complex than that. Which is why I'm hesitating to saying, giving it a label. Yes, anybody else?
Peace. If Buddha became enlightened in Bihar, why does Bihar have such a bad stereotype?
It just changed.
But if you look at someone from Makkah, their stereotype is pretty good.
The Prophet was not born in
Medina.
Mecca. Sorry?
Okay, my question is, why don't Bihari try to improve their stereotype by saying we are land where Buddha got enlightened?
I don't know. We should ask them. I mean, really. Nor do I know. I mean, I haven't been to Mecca, I haven't been to Medina, nor do I know what happened there. So it's hard for me. Anything else?
Anybody?
So firstly, I would like to thank you for enlightening us with such a great
Gosh,
information.
you already got it. Impossible.
I just need to ask, like as you said, we need to train our mind, train our brain. So as I find so many students out here, so just in behalf of them, and as a mother of a kid of 2 years old,
What? You don't look it.
so I need to know like to train a mind, to train a brain, how to start a thing, like at a very start level also.
See, the theory is very simple. The practice is difficult. So let me tell you the simple part. The brain now, in recent years, the ability to map the brain and actually photograph it and to go into its texture and substance has become very sophisticated. It's nowhere near what a MRI does to your gallbladder, or to your intestines, or to your heart. It's still an approximation. So what we do is we go into brain scans and you look for changes. Something grows larger and something grows smaller, and then you have I never pronounce it right, but it's called the amygdala part of the brain, which is where the emotions reside. So they found that just like if you want to train your arm, you have to keep doing an exercise. So when I was saying that practice and the mental diet, so if we keep approaching, as I gave you the examples of compassion, so we keep thinking about interdependence. A very important part of the practice is mother's love. So we keep thinking about mother's love because that love is truly unconditional. So we have a meditation that a child is not going to be able to do that, but understanding the principle is that you begin to visualize your mother. You with great intensity, the mother's warmth, and you'll never forget, your mother, the feeling of her warmth and the way her body smells, that subtle kind of particular warmth which another woman will never have, not even your wife or husband. So it's that kind of, so you bring that up to consciousness and then you dovetail that with someone you're neutral to. So you have these techniques, and that is why parenting, the whole idea of nurture is so important, because it has to do with repetition. Exercise the repetition. And now we know, and they have looked at turnarounds with as little as 200 hours. But they say if you meditate for 200 hours, which means that if you keep focusing and keep repeating a positive idea or a positive thought with concentration and focus, you begin to see changes in the brain. I mean, physically see the changes in the brain. But there's the converse of it too. That, of course, if you stop, then, it'll last for a while, but it can also reverse itself. So the hypothesis that we had as recently as 20 years ago, that you're born with your brain and it can't change, has been physiologically, physically, empirically proved to be wrong. The brain can change. It can change physiologically, physically, in a way that you can identify. So it has to ultimately do with. And so, we were all taught, how to do numbers or tables, 10 times table, 50, 20. And today you have computers. Now that repetition of learning used to sharpen the brain's memory and its capacity to recall. So it was like a training. When we do our jap, we don't understand often the sophistication of our own heritage. People, the Westerners came along and started saying, who these gods they were, they're worshipping tens of thousands of people. What they didn't realize is that each different deity has a particular psychosomatic physiological impact. Today we know that, a certain color makes a certain impact. Red is danger, blue seems to be calming, and a certain form. So in my case, for example, at one point, my teacher thought that I needed to be sort of more affirmative. And so I began a practice of a wrathful deity, so that I could imbibe the qualities of the deity that was suitable for my particular needs. So each deity, and that's why there are thousands, because great masters will come along and say, so traditionally why do we have, Lord Ganesh, at one point the trunk is going left and the other is going to right. There's a purpose. And it's not just a verbalized purpose. It depends on our particular psychological map. Which is why when we see a particular picture, we feel good. If we see something else, we feel agitated. So similarly for a child, it really means nurturing. And what is the thing that most important in nurturing is love and concentration. Compassion. The mother gives that, it's received, and whatever it is, try and help the child to concentrate. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Right, so
Yeah, yes.
Oh, okay.
Two questions I have.
Gosh.
One question is, you just said that you belong to Ramakrishna Paramhans, Swami Ranganathan.
Okay, carry on.
Yeah. So I just wanted to know that what motivated you that you jumped from there
I
to
didn't. Okay,
maybe from there to Buddhism. Is there any factor and is there any?
No factor at all. I didn't jump. Seriously. See, what it is that, we have such an incomplete understanding because of, I think, the politicization of everything, politicization of religion. Do you know that Swami Vivekananda himself has said that the Buddha is my Ishta and Ramakrishna is my master? So why should I have a problem? And don't forget that Vivekananda, that the Buddha is an agnostic and Ramakrishna is a bhakta. The principal student of a bhakta is able to say that an agnostic is my Ishta. And if you want to know the detail, I'll share them to you. So, the Swami Ranganathananda was in the highest traditions. And if he were alive, he'd be on the same platform as any other great master. And so, in fact, it was Swamiji, who was my first teacher, who urged me and said, your temperament or your need for a mental diet seems more in sync with Buddhism. And if you go to the rooms of many of the monks in the Ramakrishna missions, you'll see a picture of the Buddha. The Vivekananda, when Ramakrishna passed away, you go to the house in Calcutta, you'll see a room dedicated to the Buddha where he went and he meditated after Ramakrishna passed away about what he should do to honor his master. And so the Ramakrishna mission was created on the Buddhist model of the Sangha. Decentralized, they elect their leader, they celebrate all traditions. As did Ramakrishna. And I want to retell this, and you'll have to forgive me for taking another 2 minutes because it's so crucial. It's not just about the Dalai Lama going and praying in the mosque. It is, as I said, it is about Ramakrishna. And when it was Swamiji's birth centenary, there was an event and His Holiness went and said, I am an inheritor of the commitment of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition to interfaith harmony and embracing. And we'll have Swami Apna Priyananda here this evening to talk about this. But let me flag it because it's crucial as part of our collective consciousness because it has just been lost. And so here was Ramakrishna. He was a bhakta, an avatar of Rama and Krishna. Not technically, he was much more subtle than that. And what does he do? He goes out in his own, he was a pujari at that, of a lower caste queen. And what does he do? He engages in the sadhanas of all the traditions of Hinduism. Dvait, Advait, Tantra, Totapuri, all these people come into his life and he does this in full public view. What does he do after that? He goes outside the precincts of the temple and he builds a kutir, a cottage, where he lives the life of a Muslim. And he eats their food. Now what kind of, what are we doing with Swami Vivekananda today? This is not me or some secrets that I have unearthed. No, seriously. Yeah. This is there in public knowledge. It is just that it doesn't come up in our discourse because it doesn't suit certain interest groups or certain processes.
Yeah, and the second question is...
Oh gosh, that was a tough one, but anyway.
Buddhism is called like as Gnostic philosophy.
Sorry?
It is called as Gnostic philosophy. I don't know.
It's called Narcissistic.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
It is Gnostic
Gnostic,
philosophy.
yes.
Gnostic philosophy.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate on that? Do you think that it's a Gnostic philosophy or not?
Of course not. Because I think it comes from a misunderstanding that because, particularly in the tradition where we talk about shunya and emptiness, and that there is a great emphasis on suffering, and so we say this. Actually, what it is that when we talk about compassion, what as the aspiration, what can be more joyous an experience, than compassion? But, and this is again something that I'm hoping that will come up with my friend John, who's sitting here in the discussion this evening, is that what is really a faith? Is it what the scriptures we ascribe and said? Is it the way it is lived? Is it the way it's practiced? Is it the way I say it is? Is it the way the Dalai Lama says it is? Is it frozen in what a particular person says about it and then we quarrel about it? So it is the manner in which it is lived and experienced by each individual in his life. And if it is, something that is, makes one feel gloomy and reject the world, then I'm foolish to practice it, if that's the effect is happening on me. So we should all be looking at, our religions and traditions that give us the fullness of life, that give us happiness and joy. And if it isn't, then I would argue it's not for us. Maybe some other religion is for us.
Yeah, science या आध्यात्मिक.
Sorry?
Science
Uh-huh.
or आध्यात्मिक meditation. Always school students include. School board.
Sorry, I didn't get that. Could someone help me? Science and? Yes, of course it should be taught in schools. Well, yes. Anything that's, no, really, anything obviously that's, that's.
All school.
Yeah, but I'm always nervous
Meditation class. Meditation classes.
Sir, it's dangerous because, you can also teach them to meditate on dangerous things. And so, I think this thing of one size fits all. But if you were to say to me that, look, we should make an attempt to help young people nurture inclusive values, I would say most certainly yes.
In day-to-day life, we came across...
What is your name, young man?
Prasad Zadu.
Sorry?
Prasad Zadu.
Prasad Zadu. And where are you studying?
Priyadarshini School.
Wonderful that all of you have come here to help us make this a success. So I want to thank you on behalf of everybody else.
Thanks, sir.
Okay.
In day-to-day life, we came across many religions, just like Hindu,
Slowly.
Muslim, Islam, and there are different ways of teaching. My question is that in man's life, man want to live his life by praising the God and by doing hard work. And my question is that by the point of view of Dalai Lama and Buddhism, what is more important, by praising the God or hard work?
Well, in our sense, that if you do hard work with the right motivation to help people, the gods will be the most pleased. Got it? Because ultimately, what does God want? He wants us all to be happy, isn't it? And He wants us to be well. So if we are looking after everybody and everybody is happy and well, then God will be very happy. That doesn't mean we ignore God, then you might get into trouble. But we respect God and we see God in everybody and we help everybody, and then God will be even more pleased. Thank you. Good question.
One question over here.
Sir.
This is not really a political question, but I want to ask you, from the viewpoint of what is happening in China, the virus, do you think it is some form of a karma?
Of course. Not just in China. What's happening everywhere in the world at every minute, at every second, at every millisecond. Because you see, it is basically, it is both science and our philosophy. And that is causality. There has to be a cause for something. And it is also evolutionary biology. Sometimes when things happen that we think are terrible, they turn out to be, I think that was a very useful and value. So the human genius is to turn and learn from adversity, so to turn it into something valuable. So, of course, then I think we have a wonderful lady who will be talking about karma this afternoon after this. And then you have different layers of karma. You have individual karma, collective karma. That there's the whole cosmology of the kinds of karma and how they manifest and how they interplay. But ultimately, we know that we may not be able to understand or identify the particular cause. And again, the mistake we make when you talk about karma is that when people say, "Oh, karma is cause and effect," what we forget is that it causes. So it's a number of causes. Some cancel each other out, some reinforce each other, that come together for it to manifest in everything that happens. Does that make sense? Yay!
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being so patient and listening. And for all the people who are, when I was, it happens when you speak, suddenly you forget what you're going to say, and you look at somebody's face and they nod, then you feel that, yes, it gives you comfort. So a lot of you nodded, and so I have to be really grateful, like John is just now nodding. Thank you, John.